Today, I'm going to discuss a problem that I see cropping up time after time at companies. In fear that something might be missed, a large amount of data is just thrown into testing in hopes that a meat grinder approach will solve the problems that have happened in the past. So we're going to discuss the inherent fallacies about that approach and how we can test data differently. And also, for those of you who are in healthcare, protect your clients' data and not get sued. So a little about me. I'm Doug. I have been doing this since 1999. I actually got my start in video games, and I have worked in small companies and large companies, from industry giants like Cisco and Electronic Arts and United Health Group, to tiny little companies you've never heard of. I specialize in implementing tools, process, QA departments and companies, and CI/CD pipelines. I have 2 kids. You can see them there. And for fun, I like to teach swing dancing, rock climb, and take pictures, which you might see a couple in the background here today. So there is a constant concern that real data will break our software, and so we need to be testing with it to make sure our software is stable. The first common way to do this is to use live data ported from production to lower environments. While this seems like a good idea, it requires you to be very careful about who has access to the data. It also comes with a hidden cost. Every time you load data from production, you must spend time finding new data to replace it. If you need someone with high blood pressure who has never been referred to a heart specialist, as soon as that real person gets referred, you now have to go spend time looking for new test data for some person that meets that requirement again. This can cause hours or days of slowdown in the process. Furthermore, you cannot use this data in your automation if you send it through a vendor like Sauce Labs, because they cannot be responsible for your PII or your PHI. So then some people jump to de-identification. The process of de-identification, if you haven't heard of it, is a process that removes all personal identifiers from your data. You need to be careful with this, though, as people often forget things like notes fields, where the doctor might have put in information and entered the patient's real name or other information that's considered PII or PHI. While this is typically safer from a PI perspective, it isn't foolproof, and it still comes with the other problems of the data constantly churning on you. A third common solution is to randomly generate a lot of user data in the hopes of covering all scenarios. It protects client data, but is a shotgun approach generally more suited to making people feel better due to large numbers of records than well-crafted testing data. So, as a solution, we want to separate out functional and data testing. We need tests that target the functionality of our software. They need to run quickly so we can run them often. In the old days of automation, which, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years, it was thought that the benefit of automation was we could run large sets of data through that humans just couldn't process, and we could get all this information that we needed. And while this is true, that is the focus of performance testing these days, not functional testing. Functional testing is also often referred to as end-to-end testing or UI testing. It is testing the final product. As such, we want to be confident that when we change anything, that we can run all of those tests. This is the idea behind continuous delivery. Running tests every day or hour is great, but we also want to run it every time a commit is made. And whenever I go into a company, that's where I am trying to get them, so that we're running our automation on every single commit. That means that we need to run through our suite as quickly as possible, which means we really need to focus in on our functional tests. Separately, we have concerns about our data. Issues found in production can often be traced back to issues with loading data from one system to another. This is where extract, transform, and load, or ETL testing, comes in. We need to verify that the data being loaded is correct at the time that we load it. This ensures that we will not have surprise data issues later on. It also gives us confidence that every possible permutation will work without trying to test every possible permutation. So, a brief interlude. You can't plan for everything. Back in 2000, I worked on a game called The Sims. You might have heard of it, by Maxis. Specifically, I worked on The Sims Online. I was managing all of the closed and open beta testing, so we had thousands of players trying out our stuff. I was also in charge of managing 200 individual actual testers at Electronic Arts in 7 different countries who were scheduled to test 24 hours a day so that we could get data constantly. And we were doing this for a couple of months. And so you'd think, yeah, we're going to catch everything all the time. We had automated test suites running constantly. We were doing 2 development builds a day. And we were doing a push to production every night. And we were still having issues. And this really, the story is to highlight, we had something come up where we had what they called the nude bug. So in The Sims, when your sim gets undressed, we do a little blur. And then, you know, they can go take a shower or whatever. Well, that little blur went away. And it didn't show anything, but people got very upset about it, and the higher ups. And it was a very intense production issue. A little different than, you know, some of the stuff that we deal with in the healthcare industry. But what we ended up doing was spending a bunch of time to figure out that individual issue. What we did know, though, was that it was something that a player was doing that we had not reproduced. And because we weren't concerned about whether or not the game itself was working, it was really about the data. In this case, the player input that we were getting that we didn't have control over. And what was happening is the player was jumping in and out of a bathtub a certain amount of times, and doing all sorts of weird things. And it's just the kind of thing that we couldn't catch because nobody was doing stuff like that. Anyway, so talking about functional testing. Like the Eiffel Tower, our code needs to be a flexible framework that can bend without breaking to meet the various requirements thrown at it. I'm going to talk about this briefly. So what I use typically is BDD Cucumber. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this. This is something that most people have seen. There are other solutions. You know, basically the stuff that you're sending to Sauce Labs is covering this functional testing. What I try to do is use Cucumber to communicate to business owners, because BDD is intended to be written so that the business owner can understand it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but the importance of the business owner understanding it is we want them to feel comfortable that even though we're not throwing every single piece of live production data at it, that live production data will work. So that means they need to understand all of the tests that you're doing. And so I find that using BDD to show them what the tests are going to look like is very helpful. This particular example is just a login page. It's something that we've all seen and dealt with. The second part is reports. And actually, we just got to see a bunch of cool reports that Sauce Labs uses. So that's a cool thing to use as well. I happen to have some reports that I shoot out in addition, but I've also been using the Sauce Labs reports. I think they're great. But having a reporting structure that you can send to the business owners to give them a sense of comfort, and at any time they can see what's going on, is going to help you in communication when you're trying to separate out this data versus functional testing. So, ETL testing. Ensuring the quality of our data. So a lot of times what's going to happen is we're going to get data into our system. It's going to come in through who knows what. If we're lucky, it's going to come through an API. Sometimes it comes through an Excel sheet or a comma delimited file. Today I'm going to walk you through a very simple example of what it would look like to do some ETL testing. If somebody were to send us an Excel file, this is actually based on something that I've had to deal with before, and then transforming that into the database and moving that information around. So we have our Excel file on the left here. So we've got two sheets. Our first sheet is a list of doctors. So it's got their name, their location, and their specialty. And then we've got a specialty sheet. And we've got two specialties, a knee specialty and a cardio specialty, and a description of knee stuff and heart stuff. So now if we look over here on the database side, we take a look at what our tool has put into the database. So we've got our MySQL, we've got our doctor, our name, our location, our foreign key, which is going to map to here. And then we've got our specialty and our description. So we're looking at that and we're trying to figure out, okay, so how do I make sure that this ETL stuff is going to work? So this is an example of something that I did using Python. And so I created this YAML file. And so we've got this local host, we've got a login and password in the YAML file, which try not to store things there, but for the example, I had put it there. And obviously we don't want to use poor passwords. So we've got our sheet 1 and our sheet 2, and what these do is these describe where in the database. So we've got a specialty, we've got a specialties database, and it's got a specialty and description. And then we've got our first database, our docs database. So we have our name, our location, and then we're telling it that we've got this foreign key. And this piece here actually kind of maps to this SQL here, just as an example of what that would look like. So, you know, we can create these complex queries in a configuration file and kind of look at it. And one of the questions I get about this is, well, why don't we just use queries? Well, there's a couple of reasons, but the first one is we sometimes have QA people who are not as technical. That's an issue that I run into a lot. So we're creating a way for less technical people to do this. That also means that sometimes you can hand this work off to an analyst or even a product owner if they're interested in getting involved in this and they want to get more involved. They don't need to understand SQL to be able to understand the mapping, because sometimes those are the people who actually understand the mapping. So I created a system that allows people to do that. And I'm going to go on to the next slide. So a lot of times we get what if? What if the client does this, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those particular issues. Why do I care? The first thing you got to do is you have to convince people that they care about this issue, that it is important and it is going to save them time. So I threw up some examples here. So if you have a business person, they are concerned about not missing anything. Typically what you will find is a business person does not care about data. They do not care about what's going into the system until you get your first production bug. And then they care a whole lot. They don't know how to have confidence in the system. And so when you're talking to a business person, if you're lucky and you haven't had a production issue, what you're telling them is, hey, I want you to always have production or confidence in the production system. If you have had this issue, then this is an approach that you can take to say, I understand that we have data issues. I understand that we have a problem we need to deal with. And here is a solution that I want to propose to you that we are going to be able to do in a reasonable amount of time. And you can have confidence that any data going into the system is going to be dealt with easily and correctly. If we're talking to a manager, we can, they want to communicate with confidence that we can handle any data. They're very much interested, you know, in talking to the team, understanding what the team is doing, and then communicating that to the business. And so we want them to be confident that when QA and development say, oh yeah, this is good, we got this, that they're not going to get bit in the ass later. For QA, one of the common issues that we run into is too much data to test and can't meet deadlines. So, you know, you're given a huge amount of data that you're trying to go through, and you end up having to go through it manually because you don't have time to automate it. Or you're given a deadline and you say, well, I've got 6 weeks of work in a 1-week deadline. What do I do about this? By separating out our functional testing and being confident in our functional testing as a QA group, when you get all of this data and you have a data issue, you can confidently point back and say, I know this isn't a functional issue, we should be looking at the data. That level of confidence when you get a production issue is going to make a huge difference in the level of calm that everyone else has. When you get a production issue, as the QA representative, you want to have some confidence about what is causing the issue, even if you're not the person dealing with the code and you're not the person who's going to fix it. If you can confidently say, our stuff works, this is a data issue, let's look at the data, it helps to calm people's fears. As a developer, we don't want to be spending all of our time fixing data issues. We want to be spending our time on coding the software and moving forward. So by doing this, developers don't need to spend time getting production data or dealing with production data that somebody else in the organization gave to us. They don't need to be spending time dealing with a bug where they don't know if it's a data issue or a functional issue, which means that your developers are going to spend less time resolving bugs because they can more easily pinpoint the problem because they have confidence in the functionality of the software and they know that it is a data issue. So the next part is client interaction. Depending on the size of your company and who you're working with, this may be a larger or smaller problem. It could be the lifeblood of your company. It could be that your client is actually somebody internal. Where I'm working now, I'm working at Optum and United Health Group. So all of our clients are actually all owned by the same parent company, but they're all multi-million-dollar businesses and they have desires and things that they want taken care of. So you need a level of client interaction that is helpful. And when it comes to ingesting a client's data, people get very touchy. So we want to use an impersonal system to do that. If you set up an impersonal system, right? So like a web page that you would upload an Excel file to, and that web page says, oh, you've got these things you need to fix. A person seeing that is going to go, oh, I got to go fix that. If they send that zip file to you and then they wait a day and then you look at it and then you send them back an email, hey, you got these things wrong, it's suddenly a personal interaction. And while you can keep those interactions on a positive note as much as possible, when it comes from a piece of technology, people don't take it personally. They just want to get it done and they will go fix the issue. Another problem that this prevents is sometimes people on your development team or your data ingestion team are trying to be helpful. So they will take a client's data and they will fix it so that it fits in the system because they think they know what it should look like. The problem that you run into is if they make a bad guess, you're going to end up with bad data in production, and it's not the data that the customer sent over. So by putting in an impersonal technology solution to look at the data and check it before it comes in, you're going to solve a bunch of client interaction issues. And so this is another way to sell it to the business. A lot of times business groups don't want to spend time on something like this because it's good enough. And you sell it to them by you're creating a better customer experience for people. And then the other half of that is with the business. They want to be able to communicate data issues effectively. And the way that you do that is by having good reporting on your ETL testing. If you have your ETL testing going and you can say, hey, these 5 lines of data didn't go in correctly, or we had issues, the business can communicate that back to the client, and they can have that conversation and say, hey, we're noticing these things keep coming through. That would be a thing that you should work on. This is going to help with the client interaction, which is, again, one of the common sticking points with moving to this kind of testing. So, next steps, where do we go from here? You start with a dialogue. You need to discuss the problem and ensure that everyone understands the solution. That's why I went through and talked about the different needs that different people have. You may need to do a trial run. You may need to do this side by side with what you're already doing. But even an example of this or a small data set is going to show the benefits of doing this and allow people to have comfort going forward that things are going to work. And it's going to speed up your testing immensely. So that is my presentation. I tried to run through it a little faster because I heard we were behind, so I'm about 5 minutes ahead. But I've put on here a couple of links, and I think we're gonna send this slideshow out later. But I have created a framework that actually works with Sauce Labs that does BDD. It's completely open source. I've used it at a number of companies, including the company I'm working at now. And it has an example project that allows you to get up and running in less than an hour. So if that's something that you are struggling with, figuring out what to use to get your stuff into Sauce Labs or to write automation, feel free to take a look at that. There's my email and my website, which has my blog, and I talk about this issue and other issues on there. And that's everything.
Doug, thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing your time with us and your knowledge. Just curious from the audience if there's any questions, since we do have a little bit of time. Does anybody want to ask Doug anything while we have him? I have some if they don't.
Go for it.
Well, so first question I have is, you know, you spoke to something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, which is really just understanding kind of like why we're doing all this, right? What are the business owners? How do you get them interested in what's happening? Because, you know, if you get their attention, then of course you get potentially more funding. You can do more things. You can get better outcomes for yourself as well.
Right.
And I'm curious, like, how hard is it in your experience to really get a business owner's attention on test and on test strategy?
That's a great question. It really depends on the business owner. And I think that another thing that I might talk about a little more is, how do you get them interested, right? How do you take somebody who doesn't have an interest in test and get them interested in testing? And the first part of that is communication, right? In these COVID times, it's a lot harder to go walk over to somebody's desk and say hi. But I think that personal relationships, where you've got FaceTime or even just chatting time, is good. You want people to trust that you know what you're talking about, and they're going to trust that by spending time interacting with you, regardless of the kind of interaction they have. So I actually try and get to know the person, and I like to listen to their problems. So I spend a lot of time talking to the business, and nowadays I will do things like ask for a one-on-one. So we'll do a Zoom meeting between the two of us for 15 minutes, and I'll say, hey, can you tell me what the client is saying? Can you tell me what kinds of things that you're dealing with? What are some of your concerns? And it's partially to find out for me what is going on in the company, what is driving the product that we're using, and it's partially to let them tell me what's bothering them so that I can listen and see if I might know something that they don't know, or a solution to a problem. Because even if they're giving us stories and all this information, there may be things that we're not hearing. And so it's a good way to communicate. But I honestly think that if you have someone who is not invested, that's how you get them invested. As far as percentages, I would say that the people who aren't interested in QA have been bitten by it, especially when it comes to automation. And so there you have an uphill battle, and you really just want to take small chunks. So you want to say, hey, I'm going to automate this little, I automated this little thing. Hey, look at this, and it's giving us good results, and this thing isn't failing, and building their trust in that process.
Small wins lead to that greater trust, and you can go forward from there. I mean, it's really good advice because, you know, on my side of the industry, we're largely talking to customers and people that are, you know, practitioners. One of the things that I always ask my teams to be thinking about is ask why. Why is that thing important? And sometimes you get an answer, and sometimes you don't, or sometimes you get an answer you don't like, so you got to keep digging a little bit. And I think that that's something that we all can do better at, like just as a civilization, is just really understand why something is important, rather than just, you know, jumping in and doing it.
Exactly.
There is another question that was popped up on the Slack here, or on the Zoom chat, from Sukant, and the question is there some kind of encryption library which we can use to make data HIPAA compliant?
That's a good question. So here's the thing. You need to talk to your security and compliance departments if you're going to do that. It doesn't matter what the library is. There are a number of things that you can do to encrypt your data, but if you are using test data and you're encrypting it, at some point you're sending it like to Sauce Labs. Sauce Labs can't be responsible for your data. And most other companies, they just can't, because these kinds of things can become billion-dollar lawsuits. So you're not going to find anybody who's going to be okay with you sending them that data if they haven't agreed to it. So you're gonna have a lot more luck dealing with that by not having data that you need to encrypt, which I realize doesn't sound as easy. But if you're trying to encrypt data, again, going back to the why question, why are you trying to encrypt data? Are you trying, you know, what is it about this data that is so special that we need to send it in? And typically when I ask that question, the answer I get is, well, we want to make sure that it is like production data. We want to make sure it is real data. And the thing is that you're really jumping over from let's do functional testing to I don't trust what's going on in production. I don't have trust in the system. And so what I've discussed here is a way to develop that trust, to build that trust. And really what you're doing is you are describing to people, and hopefully a way that they can understand that we're going to have these two pieces and these two things are going to go together. Also, if people aren't understanding this, they think that the data set is small. When you're looking at, you know, 2 clients and you want to test all of the permutations for those 2 clients, sometimes that seems very doable. When those 2 clients turn into 80 clients, it's no longer doable. And so you need to be confident that you can get that information in a way. So again, if you wanted to encrypt data, you know, I'd be looking at, I don't even know. It's been a while since I've looked at encryption libraries. Like, so I wouldn't suggest anything off the top of my head. But again, you can encrypt it, but at some point it has to be decrypted so you can enter in you can search for it, et cetera, through the UI. So I don't suggest that as a safe way to do things.
Well, if I'm right, I think also that that HIPAA is, by and large, I mean, it certainly there's a certification and a compliance associated to it, but by and large, it's a series of guidelines. Mm-hmm. And again, if I'm right, I might not be right on this one, but I believe that it's you state how you are interpreting the guidelines of HIPAA, and that's what you are adhering to. Is that right, or am I thinking of something different there?
So here's the thing. Most companies who deal with HIPAA have a compliance department. Sometimes they'll have a C-level person whose job is to deal with that. They've got training programs. I've been at small healthcare companies that had a compliance department. So I would never speak for a compliance department, because they're going to tell you what is okay for that company. And so you need to be talking to your compliance person. And if you don't have a compliance person, you need to be talking to your lawyers. Because the thing is that if your data gets exposed, it immediately starts costing the company money. And it doesn't matter what your best intentions were. You know, it doesn't matter what you said you were going to do and what guidelines you followed. If the data gets exposed, you're liable, and it can get exposed. You can find it and close it down before anyone sees it. And if somebody finds out, you're still liable. So.
Yeah, and really my point behind that was it gives you that in. Going back to the previous comment about talking to other people and kind of getting understanding of it. If that is the approach, then you can say, hey, how are we adhering to HIPAA? Talk to me about what that means. And it gives you insight into the why. I think I got time for one last question for you, and not to put you on the spot at all, but well, actually I have two questions for you. First one is, what's next for healthcare? How, like, if you see something changing in the test industry, or more to the point, the software delivery industry as a whole, what's next for healthcare? How does it adapt?
So what I've experienced is that healthcare, even though it seems to be moving towards agile, and has been for a number of years, healthcare is very much behind the times as far as technology goes. You know, if you go to a technology company, like Amazon or Google, or Twitter, they are focused on continuous delivery all the time. And you can read articles about it. They check their code in multiple times per day, and that code goes to production. And healthcare companies are still really focused on the fact that they're healthcare companies. And they really need to start pivoting to the fact that they are technology companies who provide healthcare. Because everything that a healthcare company does is done is achieved through technology.